Hello, my name is Nikita Basov. I come from the Center for German and European Studies of St. Petersburg University, and I would like to thank Mitchell Center for Social Network Analysis for welcoming me here. And today I'm going to tell you about socio-semantic network analysis of meaning structures that we conduct throughout the recent years. First of all, I'd like to briefly introduce you into the history of cultural meaning studies in social network analysis. From the beginning of social network analysis in the 1930s, it has been purposefully bracketing culture for the sake of examining concrete structures of interpersonal relations between individuals. And the notion of culture was too ambiguous and difficult to formally capture to accommodate for in such studies. However, with the development of the constructivist perspective in social science, it has changed, and most prominently in the 80s, Kathleen Carley proposed her constructual theory that argued that knowledge is created socially through interaction between individuals who exchange information about relations between facts and thus develop their cognitive structures associating these facts. Further on, in the 90s, Carley's teacher Harrison White has prominently proposed his relational sociology, which explicitly incorporated culture into social network analysis. In particular, White argued that networks are intertwined with culture because social ties connect individuals as identities relating to stories of their coordinated relationships and interpretations of each other over time. And as a result, individuals are capable to gain stable footing and to feel stability in their social settings. These stories or interrelated perspectives are then associated with the particular constellations of social network ties. And so there is culture of stories associated with these constellations. And switching among such netdoms, individuals are capable of grasping the meanings inherent in these netdoms. For instance, being in relations at war and internalizing stories associated with war, individuals are nevertheless only capable of grasping the meaning of war as they get also related in peaceful relationships and the stories associated with peace. Simultaneously and quite importantly, structural approach to culture has been developed. In this approach, shared meaning was argued to reside in relations between cultural elements such as concepts or categories, which are associated with particular social contexts in which they are developed. For instance, Carley examined the notion of robo in science fiction literature, and she was showing that this focal concept was associated meaningfully with other concepts, and these in turn were associated with other concepts, and as a result, the meaning of the focal concept robo was explicated in a certain way, and it was a shared meaning persistent in the literature and changing throughout years. Finally, and most recently, in early 2000s and until now, a dual perspective on networks and culture was developed. On the one hand, it was drawing on the culture as structure as meaningful relations between elements, affiliated, on the other hand, with particular network constellation of social ties. Both of these, however, have been treated as distinct and having an equal weight to each other. So on the one hand, we have the dimension of symbolic relations between elements of culture, and on the other hand we have social relations, and individuals express themselves in symbolic relations, and at the same time symbols are associated with certain interpersonal relationships, which they represent. Simultaneously, each of the two orders has its own structure of relations and develops according to its own internal logic. This picture of relationships between social networks and cultural structure can be represented in a socio-semantic manner, the following way. But before we proceed into describing this representation, it is worth noting the basic ideas behind it. And the background of these is the notion of meaning that is molded by its context. It largely relies on the notions developed in structural linguistics, linguistic philosophy, social linguistics, and corpus linguistics, arguing that meaning of a word is defined through other words it is related to and by appearing next to them in text in a particular social context. So to understand meaning, we are to focus on context-specific word associations rather than dictionary definitions. And in local group contexts, meanings are loosely structured, ambiguous, difficult to understand for an external observer, varying across individuals, groups, and practices. So researchers' interpretation is not that good to understand these meanings. Rather, it is biasing, like close-ended survey questions impose certain perspectives on the informants, and coding imposes researchers' interpretation on the cultural data. So we need an inductive mapping techniques to understand meanings. And here's where word collocation-based semantic network techniques come into play. In these networks, nodes are words that come from verbal expressions made by individuals, and links between these words represent co-occurrences of words in the expressions. Like this. So, for instance, we may represent expressions of an artist, say, who continuously associates art to such notions as transformation, market, project, history, and culture. And this would capture the meaning of art for this individual. On the other hand, we may have artist B, who associates art slightly differently with canvas, brush, palette, project, and market. So we have another meaning of art of individual B. We may also search for the overlaps across individuals and find the semantic associations that are shared by artists. For example, artists who occupy similar social positions or reside in the same groups. So, for example, in this case, the overlapping structures represent the position of market-oriented artists. Further on, we may compare the structures of associations between concepts of market-oriented artists to, for instance, those of pure artists, the association between art and aesthetics, and art between project. And we can compare these, and we can find overlaps, so that we find semantic associations shared across different groups or social positions. Thus, we can gain a window on meaning shared in a particular social context, whether across groups or within groups. So we have semantic associations between words to represent meanings. Further on, we can account or unfold the usage of certain associations and words by individuals, which would give us cultural meanings because we know who shares them, and we can associate these meanings with particular groups of individuals or compare them across groups. Further on, we can look at interpersonal ties between these individuals who share these cultural meanings. And this brings in social network. So altogether, we have a meaning structure that includes meanings and social networks associated with each other via joint usage of meanings by individuals. To infer these structures, we need quite an elaborate set of fieldwork procedures, which I will outline now. Our setting is artistic collectives. These are groups of people who do artwork, who share work in living spaces, who engage in multiple friendships with each other, who collaborate and often create joint artworks. And also, an artistic collective is an interesting case to inquire the relationship between culture and networks. Because it combines individual and collective perspectives, it involves explicit interactions, expressions, and material practices of artists. It imposes few constraints on social ties formations, expressions, and practices, unlike, for instance, informal organizations. And finally and importantly, it represents a highly dynamic setting, so that the mutual influence of networks on culture and vice versa can be traced. In particular, we conducted 7 multi-wave ethnographic studies in the years from 2011 till 2015, conducted in London, Hamburg, St. Petersburg, Barcelona, and Madrid. And the data in our set on 90 unique core members includes 214 interviews, 118 visual observations, over 200 photo elicitations, over 100 written texts, altogether comprising 500,000 words, and 18 sociometric surveys. For semantic associations, we use transcripts of interviews, dialogues, photo elicitations, and also written texts. And as a result, we produced the semantic networks of associations between words. To capture the usage of concepts by individuals and the usage of associations, we utilized transcripts of interviews, dialogues, photo elicitations, and written text as well, so that we could capture which individual uses which words and the ways she combines these words. Finally, for interpersonal ties, we use the usual sociometric surveys within the groups, but we visually verified it with individuals, so that after conducting the survey, we mapped the structure and then showed the social network structure to individuals within the group, asking them to confirm or to object the ties that they have seen, in particular the ties that were reported differently by dyads of individuals. And then we triangulated these results with our observations of individuals in their environments and their interactions, as well as with the interview data when they narrated their relationships with others. And so we got the social networks of relations between group members. As a result, we produce these so-called 2-layer socio-semantic networks that capture the multiplicity of cultural meaning structures of the group, having meanings on top of it, cultural meanings as individuals are connected to meanings and share them, and social network of relations between individuals. We did that for multiple groups, so we had several socio-semantic networks as a result in our dataset. Further on, I will present the findings of 2 papers based on this empirical study. The first one is on local meaning structures of artistic collectives, written together with Wouter de Nooy and Alexandronenko. The theoretical background behind this paper is as follows. We are concerned here with expressed meanings. And what we know from institutional field theory is that social fields impose certain structures of social relationships on individuals and ascribe them with symbolic categories specific to their social positions. So meanings are imposed by social fields. However, simultaneously, fields and positions are mediated, and meanings of fields and positions are blended in social encounters, such as social network ties. Interactions join individuals who come from different positions and from different fields, and practice draws them together to resolve matters at hand and potentially challenge categorizations imposed by fields or positions, so that meanings may also be local and different from those imposed by the fields. For this particular analysis, we focus on 2 collectives. One of them is Что делать, which is a group of leftist politically engaged artists, and the other one is Parasite, which is concerned with more pure aesthetic, anti-commercial art. First, we analyzed meanings of the 2 collectives in the field of contemporary Russian art. On the one hand, we have politically engaged Что делать, and on the other hand, we have pure aesthetics Parasite. And the gray lines represent the overlap between the meaning structures shared within the 2 groups. At a first glance, groups seem to converge on field-imposed meanings. So we have obvious associations, topical and central for a contemporary art field, such as contemporary art, young artists, good artists, Russian art, artwork, and so on. And these are the most frequently used associations shared across the 2 groups. The groups seem to reproduce meaning structure of the field. And indeed, if we look into the interviews with the individuals and the way they use the category contemporary art, for instance, the most central category, we see that they speak of it in normative terms, like how contemporary art should be presented or what it is meant to do. At the same time, the 2 groups also diverge and instantiate these seemingly field-wide meanings differently. For instance, contemporary art category is often found to be presented very differently by politically engaged Что делать and by the pure artist Parasite. So that politically engaged Что делать have a perspective on contemporary art through the prism of a critical outlook on society, whereas Parasite rather care about form and aesthetics inherent in contemporary art. And for them, this approach to the material is distinctive. Furthermore, we also see different associations that reveal that groups have different meanings of the same terms. For instance, for Parasite, exhibition is mainly collective, in contrast to Что делать, who mostly speak about collective action and collective projects, because Parasite has the practice of collective exhibitions in a common space. This is the space of Borei Gallery in St. Petersburg. And these associations can only be understood if we know the practice and the ethnographic context of the collective. Particularly revealing in this sense are the associations with the term biennale, which are young and senior. It is hard to understand without knowing what the group is doing and their projects. In this case, we know that there is an event known as Young Biennale in Russia. That is a very prestigious, very visible event that represents young artists to the audience. And what Parasite did was an ironic exhibition mocking this international biennale for young artists, making fun of it, and also trying to balance its ageism by proposing an exhibition named Biennale of Senior Art, where they made fun of the famous Moscow curators and of the exhibition approaches. We could only know that if we were there with the group members when they were developing this exhibition, which actually, by the way, never ever happened. But presence in the field allowed us to understand and interpret these associations in context of the group practice. So in sum, the meanings that seem to be imposed by the fields are reinterpreted and reinstantiated locally by the groups. Further on, what we can do is look into meanings of the art field within a collective. For instance, we can consider Что делать group, which represents both the artistic field and the academic field. Academics are characterized by theoretical discussions and theorizations and mostly write the textual work in political and social philosophy, whereas artists mostly practice participatory art, performances and interventions. So these subgroups are characterized by very different practices. They also are quite distinct within the social ties of the group and form two subclusters within it. Moreover, they realize this distinction and explicate it in their statements about each other, academics blaming artists of being profane and theoretically useless, while artists blaming academics to be inactive and passive and subordinate during artwork creation and performances. We can consider the meanings of artists and academics together. And also the overlap between them. It is quite easy to see that both of the subgroups express the meanings inherent in their fields. For instance, artists are more concerned with art boundaries, whereas academics are more about political meaning, intellectual environments. And when we look into the contextual usage of these associations, we can find that they actually question them. So artists, for instance, are puzzled by art boundaries and the very notion of art. Moreover, meanings of academics and artists explicitly converge in the collective, as can be seen by the thick grey vertical line of the most frequent associations, which are shared by both of the subgroups, and they are centered on the notion of the political pivotal for the group. So both of the subgroups are concerned with such notions as political action, collective action, political situation, leftist movement, and so on. And these are the associations that are most frequently used by both. Interestingly, these associations are instantiated quite frequently in criticisms towards their own fields. For instance, an academic speaks about political situation in the context of academy being too passive and too cowardly and not engaging in the political process. This cultural blend, which we observe in Stodielet, has actually affected the whole art field and is known to set up the engaged leftist art agenda in Russia in the post-Soviet times, on which the participants of the group explicitly reflect. Feel free to pause the video to read the quotes that I'm presenting, so that I'm not spending too much time with them. So, conclusions from this paper are that on the one hand, by doing structural analysis of semantic associations affiliated with clusters of social ties, we can see that meanings of social fields are locally reproduced. However, by conducting qualitative analysis of these associations in texts and by considering social through these reinterpretations. The second paper I'm going to present is a later one, and it is devoted to the notion of cultural homophily and to its effects on social structure in groups. So the theoretical background is as follows. It is known that cultural similarity, through the mechanism of cultural homophily, stimulates emergence of social ties between individuals. So if people have similar tastes, views, or perspectives, they are more likely to get socially connected and to interact with each other continuously. It is also known that structure of social field imposes cultural similarities on individuals, so that individuals who are in similar social positions are also more likely to be culturally similar. Then we can expect that cultural homophily mechanism would reproduce the structure of social field by establishing social ties between individuals in similar social positions. At the same time, it is known that small group practice stimulates emergent cultural similarity between individuals across positions, just as we have seen in the Stodielet collective in the previous paper. So we can also expect cultural homophily contest fields by stimulating cultural similarities of individuals in different positions but join in the same groups, and therefore establishing social ties between them based on these local in-group cultural similarities. So we are puzzled with the question of how cultural homophily works in small groups of shared practice that bring together different field positions. We study the work of cultural homophily in the example of the field of cultural production. According to Bourdieu, this field exists between two poles, the autonomous pole and the heteronomous pole. Autonomous pole is the core of the field. It's driven by the field's internal logic and relies largely on symbolic capital to produce highbrow culture for particular high-trained and rather narrow audiences, whereas heteronomous pole relies rather on the economic capital, is driven by financial imperatives, oriented at profit and maximum broad audiences. Thus it produces mass culture. And individuals located closer to one of the poles have particular orientations inherent in these poles. So individuals closer to the autonomous pole are aesthetically oriented, or so-called artists, who value most creative freedom, originality, self-expression and process, whereas managerially oriented individuals closer to the heteronomous pole, or managers, value most economic rationality, market success, work in teams, utility and result. Note that these field positions are not the same as functions or organizational positions, albeit individuals who are positioned closer to one of the poles may prefer certain positions in organizations. For instance, individuals who value creative freedom are more likely to work in creative professions in organizations, whereas individuals who prefer focusing on project success and teamwork tend to be managers within organizations, not vice versa, according to Bourdieu. Recently, artists and managers are growingly meeting in small groups or artistic collectives. It happens in view of expansion of cultural industries and creative economies in 2000s, which led to artistic work requiring more and more rigorous coordination in marketing. And so, artists as lone wolves and artistic managers as lone wolves do not exist, or rarely exist these days. Rather, they often join together in collectives. And they have to cooperate. And they are quite different in their practices conducted within the same groups. They have different functions. As artists conduct creative work mainly, and managers coordinate, search for funding, teach sometimes for external audiences, do promotion, planning, and so on and so forth. They also have different material practice. They occupy different parts of the spaces in their residences. They also use different physical objects, as we have observed. Furthermore, they also cluster separately in social networks of the groups, whether in collaboration or in emotional attachments networks. The modularity is not that huge, but still it is present. At the same time, artistic groups are highly informal collectives of joint practice. Their members share spaces of work and leisure. They engage in joint creative and everyday activities, often become friends, often collaborate, and they do that not only within but also across the different field positions. So not only field-imposed culture, but also emergent culture is highly probable in such groups that bring together different positions. What we first try to do is to look at cultural distances within and across collectives and within and across the two positions. So we conducted multidimensional scaling based on semantic similarities between group members in terms of concept sharing and in terms of sharing associations between concepts. And what we found that individuals are rather similar within their groups, but across positions, rather than within their positions, irrespective whether we consider sharing of concepts or sharing of associations between concepts. It implies that group culture is potentially stronger in distinguishing individuals into groups, rather than culture of positions in the social field. Socio-semantic meaning structures are again helpful to infer these formally. We can represent, on the one hand, individuals in one position who are using the same concepts. And according to the cultural homophily principle, we can expect these individuals who occupy the same position to establish social ties between them. We can also expect individuals in the same positions to affiliate with the same concept associations and establish social ties between them owing to the cultural homophily principle. But if Bourdieu's theory of practice is correct, we can also expect individuals who occupy different positions but meet together in groups and in common practice and use the same concepts to be more likely to establish social ties with each other. The same refers to individuals who affiliate with the same concept associations across positions. We infer these socio-semantic meaning structures in this case with multi-level exponential random graph models, a statistical modeling technique developed in social network analysis recently to capture multiple mutually affecting and competing mechanisms of network formation, taking into account interdependencies between the observations typical for social networks. There are multiple mechanisms known to operate in social networks, and we need to know which of the structural configurations are more likely to occur resulting from these mechanisms. For instance, we may expect cultural homophily to stimulate ties between individuals who are similar rather than between those who are dissimilar, accounting for their social positions. There are many of such principles, and we need to control for them simultaneously. If we want to explain how social structure comes into being. And the most recent development is multi-level exponential random graph models. The distinctive feature of these models is they separate the processes in different levels, such as social networks and meanings. And they can treat each of these levels and the relations between them as self-organizing and mutually affecting at the same time. So we apply the models to our socio-semantic meaning structures. I won't discuss all the effects we included in the models, but only those of the theoretical interest. So we have two separate models, one for friendship social ties and another one for collaboration social ties. And what we find is that individuals who share concepts within positions are more likely to establish both social ties of friendships and of collaboration. So there is homophily within position stimulated by sharing of concepts. What we also find is establishment of social ties, of collaboration between different positions if individuals are affiliated with the same concept associations. So collaborations are likely to be stimulated by semantic associations sharing. So we observe homophily between different social positions within collective. As a next step, we'll look at the content of these particular socio-semantic meaning structures. We can represent them as a network which only includes these configurations, and we can see what in these configurations are shared within positions or across positions. And we know that social ties are stimulated by concept sharing within positions. So these are the concepts we're interested in, and these are the ties we're interested in with respect to this pattern. And we can look at the most frequent concepts shared by dyads within positions. Some of them are unique to the position, some of them are shared across, but we know that they always stimulate social ties between individuals positioned similarly. We can also look through the expressions using these concepts. And looking through hundreds of such expressions, we actually do find that using these concepts, individuals reproduce the orientations and the aspirations of their positions. For instance, artists speak about soul work, individual creativity, whereas managers express aspirations towards collective work, towards respect, and do not value individual creativity that much. What we also found, as you remember, is that common shared associations between concepts stimulate collaborations across social positions. So we can look at this core of semantic structure of the group that connects individuals together. And we can also consider the associations that are shared by collaborators from different positions. And we can also check the textual context in which they are used to see if they are used differently or similarly, blending between the different positions' meanings. Surprisingly, examining hundreds of such quotes, we find that although on the surface of the meaning structures, individuals join each other and share the same associations across their positions, when they actually use these associations in their expressions, they keep reproducing their social positions with their aspirations. Artists speaking about own experiences, artistic creation, individual investigation, whereas managers speak about their external work, relationships with institutions, and social ties. So the links across the positions that are being created owing to shared associations are created despite individuals still reproducing their social positions, in depth of their narratives. To conclude, we can say that the only way to understand cultural meaning is by considering associations between cultural elements and local contexts of social ties they are embedded in the meaning structures. We can also say that friendship and collaboration social ties contribute differently to cultural elements and to associations between cultural elements part of meaning structures. We also find that local meaning structures can contest field-imposed meaning structures, for instance by establishing social ties between different field positions. And we also find that to locate the fundamental mechanisms of meaning structuring, we need a combination of in-depth ethnographic data and statistical approaches, which often complement each other and sometimes reveal the peculiarities of how meaning structuring works in real world. This project, there is a huge team representing different universities all around Europe who collected the data for this project and processed it, and also engaged in numerous discussions of the findings. I would also like to thank for advice those who discuss the findings and the research design at different stages, and to whom I am indebted for many of the ideas presented here. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the funding received from several Russian foundations, as well as from the German Academic Exchange Service. My last remark is about the special issue of Poetics on Discourse, Meaning and Networks that is finally out and is available online starting this week, which presents a lot of related results and many others beyond that I presented here. Thank you for your attention.